A small genetics lab on the East Coast was working through a stack of samples that had come in through a large heritage study. It was supposed to be a normal week. Lab workers were checking family lineages, matching people to regions, running the same population comparisons they ran every day. The samples belonged to black families from across the American South, people from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas, who wanted to know where their ancestors came from. Then the numbers stopped lining up the way they were supposed to. It wasn't a broken machine. It wasn't a mixed-up sample. The lineage markers researchers were seeing did not match cleanly with the standard African ancestry charts everyone in the field uses. Some of the genetic signals pointed toward places the models were never built to expect. Signals that hinted at a past far older and far stranger than the simple story most of us grew up hearing. One geneticist who worked on a similar project once compared the feeling to studying a map for years and suddenly noticing you had been reading it upside down the whole time. This is not a brand new discovery. Researchers have quietly bumped into pieces of this puzzle for decades. But now, with better tools and more data than ever before, the pattern is becoming too big to brush aside. The DNA of Black America is telling a story that never made it into the textbooks. And the more scientists dig, the harder that story becomes to ignore. If you want more stories like this, the kind that never make it onto the evening news, subscribe now. This channel exists to dig up the history that got buried, one episode at a time. Here's the story most of us were taught. Enslaved Africans were taken from the coast of West Africa, from places we now call Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, and Senegal, and brought across the Atlantic in chains. That history is real. It is documented, painful, and central to who Black Americans are today. Nobody is disputing that West African roots run deep in Black American genetics, because they absolutely do. But that is not the whole picture. And for a long time, the parts left out of that picture were treated as footnotes, oddities, or mistakes, instead of what they actually were. Evidence of a much bigger and more complicated history. The first hints of something more complex showed up long before anyone had a DNA testing kit. Scientists studying old skeletons from colonial burial grounds in places like Virginia and Maryland kept running into bones that didn't match their expectations. The measurements, the bone structure, small details in the skull and teeth, sometimes didn't line up with the West African populations researchers were using for comparison. For years, these findings were treated as noise, bad measurements, sloppy comparisons. Nobody wanted to build a new theory around a handful of confusing skeletons, so the oddities got tucked into academic papers that almost nobody read. Then, in the 1990s, everything changed with the arrival of mitochondrial DNA testing. This new tool lets scientists trace a person's maternal line back through thousands of years, mother to mother to mother in an unbroken chain. When researchers pointed this new tool at Black communities in the rural South, especially isolated communities that had stayed in the same place for generations, the results didn't just confirm what everyone expected. They opened up new questions nobody had thought to ask. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what a haplogroup actually is. Think of it as a genetic label passed down through one parent, unchanged, generation after generation. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child, so your maternal haplogroup tells you exactly which ancient population your mother's and her mother's line came from, going back thousands of years. It doesn't get mixed or diluted. It's either there or it isn't. For descendants of the Atlantic slave trade, scientists expect certain African haplogroups to dominate, labeled things like L1, L2, and L3. And they do show up strongly in almost every Black American sample tested. Nobody's arguing with that. But other things show up too. Genetic markers connected to Indigenous American populations. Markers linked to parts of the Middle East. Markers that are rare in West Africa but common somewhere else entirely. And these aren't tiny, meaningless traces. In some communities, they show up often enough that simple explanations, like a random European ancestor centuries ago, don't fully cover it. I want to pause here, because there's always a point in a video like this where the research runs deeper than what fits into 20 minutes. I've put the fuller breakdown, the studies, the numbers, everything, in the pinned comment below. If you want the whole picture, go check it out after this. One of the more debated genetic markers researchers have found in Black American samples is a lineage that is common in indigenous populations across North America, in parts of the Middle East, and in some European groups, but is rare across most of sub-Saharan Africa. Finding it in Black American genetic profiles at rates too high to dismiss as coincidence is the kind of detail that gets discussed in academic papers but almost never makes it into the news. Then there are lineages linked strongly to Indigenous American ancestry. Most consumer DNA companies label this simply as Native American and move on. But that label hides a much messier and more interesting question. When did that mixing actually happen? Under what circumstances? Was it recent, during, and after slavery, or does it go back further than anyone assumed? This pattern shows up again and again in tight-knit black communities along the Gulf Coast, in Florida, and across the Carolinas, communities that have lived in the same region for many generations and kept detailed oral histories. The question researchers keep circling back to isn't whether these unexpected markers exist. They clearly do. The question is what they actually mean and whether the scientific community has been comfortable enough with the simple version of the story to avoid asking. Nowhere does this get more complicated than with a group of communities in the Appalachian Mountains, centered around the area where Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky meet. European settlers who first encountered these families in the 1600s described people who were already living there, already farming fixed land, already speaking a form of English, and already had families and communities established. Nobody in the historical record could quite figure out where they had come from. The families themselves didn't have one single agreed-upon origin story. Their appearance didn't fit into any of the racial categories European colonists were used to sorting people into. Over the years, different theories floated around. Some said they were Portuguese sailors who had settled inland. Some guessed Turkish traders. Some thought they were Cherokee families who had intermarried with settlers. And some believed they were free Africans who had arrived in North America before the large-scale slave trade even began. A genetic study published in 2012 was supposed to finally settle the question. Instead, it made things more complicated. The researchers found a strong mix of African and European genetic markers, supporting the idea of a founding population made up of free black and white families. But they also found Indigenous American genetic signals that didn't fit neatly into that story. And when they looked closely at mutation patterns in certain lineages, some of the evidence suggested these family lines had been in North America for a lot longer than a simple colonial-era arrival could explain. This community isn't a one-off case. It's the most studied example of a much bigger pattern that shows up across the American South and Mid-Atlantic region. Similar mixed heritage communities exist in Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina, and North Carolina, each with their own name, their own oral history, and their own long-standing claim that their ancestors were free people, not enslaved people, who arrived before the strict racial categories of later American history had even been invented. What connects all these communities isn't a single shared origin. It's the fact that their genetics consistently break the simple, clean, either-or story that the standard slavery narrative was built around. Any honest conversation about Black American DNA has to include a hard truth about how these ancestry tests actually work, because a lot of the confusion starts before your sample ever reaches a lab technician's desk. When a big consumer DNA company tells you your ancestry breakdown, they aren't comparing your DNA against some perfect, complete map of humanity. They're comparing it against a limited collection of reference samples, real people whose DNA has been chosen to represent an entire region or ethnic group. How accurate your results are depends almost entirely on how complete and how well built those reference samples are. Over the last several years, the African reference panels used by major testing companies have gotten better, but they're still heavily tilted toward the exact populations connected to the historical slave trade routes, groups from West Africa. Populations from Central Africa, East Africa, and the Horn of Africa are still badly underrepresented, and North African ancestry often gets lumped into a vague North African or Middle Eastern category that never really connects back to the Black American experience in any meaningful way. What that means, in practice, is simple. If a Black American's ancestry traces back to a Central African group that isn't well represented in the database, that ancestry might get mislabeled, matched to the closest available group instead of the real one. Or it might just disappear entirely into a vague, unassigned percentage that most reports include, but rarely explain in any detail. The problem gets even worse when it comes to Indigenous American ancestry. Most consumer testing panels only include a small number of Indigenous reference samples, and those samples are usually drawn from a narrow set of specific tribal groups. Ancestry, connected to groups that had extensive long-term contact with enslaved and free Black communities across the colonial South, including several well-known Southeastern nations, often gets absorbed into a generic Native American category, or worse, flagged as too uncertain to report at all. And that last point matters more than people realize. Most consumer tests won't even report an ancestry estimate if it falls below 1 or 2%. So if someone has a small but real percentage of ancestry from a population the database can't confidently pin down, that ancestry simply vanishes from the final report. Not because it isn't real, because the system wasn't built to catch it. One of the most complicated and still unfolding parts of this whole story involves several Native American nations historically located in the Southeast, whose citizens once enslaved Black people before and during the Civil War, and who also, over many generations, intermarried with Black and mixed heritage families, sometimes going back to the earliest colonial period. By the late 1800s, when the federal government created official rolls to determine tribal citizenship, there were large numbers of people who were both genetically and culturally connected to Black and Indigenous communities at the same time. Those federal rolls split people into separate categories based on race, and that separation carried real legal weight. It determined who could claim land, who received treaty benefits, and who the federal government would formally recognize as a citizen of a tribal nation. Those old classifications have been fought over in courtrooms for well over a century, including a major legal battle in the 2000s and 2010s that eventually reached a settlement restoring citizenship rights to descendants who had been removed from tribal rolls decades earlier. But underneath all of that legal and political history, the DNA tells a different, older story than those paper records ever did. Genetic studies of black communities in Oklahoma, Texas, and along the Gulf Coast have consistently found high rates of Indigenous American genetic markers, the kind that suggest deep, multi-generational ancestry, rather than a single recent mixed relationship. These aren't people with one distant Indigenous relative several generations back. These are family lines that trace directly through unbroken maternal or paternal lineages into populations that were indigenous to this continent for centuries. The legal fight over tribal citizenship is about recognition and rights. The genetic story is about something different, historical truth. They're not the same battle, but they're both circling the same buried history. Before we go any further, I want to remind you that the pinned comment below has the fuller version of everything I'm covering here, the actual studies, the numbers, the sourcing. Go take a look when you get a chance. Now here's where things get genuinely uncomfortable for a lot of mainstream researchers. There's a growing, peer-reviewed body of research suggesting contact between African populations and the Americas long before Christopher Columbus ever set sail. One study out of a research institute in Ecuador found African genetic signatures in indigenous Amazonian populations that couldn't be explained by anything that happened after European colonization. Based on the length of shared genetic segments, a method scientists used to estimate how long ago two populations mixed, researchers dated this contact to roughly 1,000 years ago, centuries before Columbus. A separate major study published in the early 2020s, analyzing ancient genetic material recovered from human remains in Brazil, found signals connected to populations from Australia and the surrounding Pacific region showing up in ancient South American DNA. The research team gave this mysterious ancestral group a placeholder name and admitted, openly, that they could not fully explain how those genetic signatures ended up there. None of this directly proves anything specific about Black American ancestry on its own. But it matters, because it proves something bigger. Human movement into and across the Americas was far more complicated, far older, and far more global than the simple story of people walking across a land bridge from Asia thousands of years ago. If genetic traces connected to West Africa and the Pacific were already present in the Americas before Columbus ever arrived, then the question of exactly who was already living here and who their descendants eventually became gets a lot more complicated. A researcher named Ivan van Sertma made a version of this argument back in the 1970s, long before the genetic tools existed to test it. At the time, mainstream academics largely dismissed him. The genetic evidence that's come out since then hasn't proven every single claim he made, but it has backed up his central instinct, that the pre-Columbian Americas were never as isolated from the rest of the world as the dominant historical model assumed. That has real consequences for how we should read Black American DNA today. Because if there were already African-connected or African-adjacent populations somewhere in the Americas before the transatlantic slave trade even began, then some of what gets casually labeled Native American ancestry in a modern Black American's genetic report might actually be pointing towards something far older and stranger than a single indigenous ancestor a few generations back. Along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, there's a community that functions almost like a living genetic time capsule. These families descend mostly from enslaved Africans brought directly from a specific corridor connected to Sierra Leone and the surrounding West African coast. Because these island communities stayed geographically isolated for so long, they kept an unusually strong genetic and cultural connection to their African roots. Their language even preserves grammar patterns and vocabulary from West African languages that disappeared almost everywhere else in the diaspora. Genetic testing on these communities confirms the strong, direct link to Sierra Leone and the broader West African region. In a lot of ways, this is the one place where the standard historical story actually lines up cleanly with the genetic data. But even here, in a population specifically chosen by researchers because of how well it preserves its African roots, scientists have still found genetic markers that don't fit neatly into the West African reference panels. They found Indigenous American genetic signals at rates too high to explain through contact after slavery ended alone. What that tells us is something important. Even in the population where the traditional slave trade story holds up best, there are still hidden layers underneath it. Layers representing contact, mixing, and movement that happened before the slave ships arrived, during the earliest years of colonization, in ways plantation records never wrote down, or in the years right after emancipation, when Black and Indigenous communities across the rural South mixed freely and had children whose family histories were never formally recorded anywhere. The real archive of this history isn't sitting in some courthouse basement, it's written into people's blood. There's a part of this story that gets talked about even less than the maternal lineage findings, and that's the paternal side, traced through the YY chromosome, passed down from father to son, generation after generation, unbroken. In the context of Black American history, this data has to reckon with a brutal and well-documented reality. The widespread sexual violence enslaved women were subjected to frequently broke the paternal family lines of enslaved communities and replaced them with the bloodlines of enslavers. That's a major reason why Black American Y chromosome results tend to show noticeably higher rates of European ancestry than the maternal DNA results do. The presence of white slaveholders in the South wrote itself permanently into the paternal genetics of enslaved families, in a way the maternal line never reflected in the same manner. But even accounting for that painful history, the Y chromosome data in Black American men carries signals that don't fit cleanly into a simple European versus West African split. The dominant paternal lineage among Black American men connects strongly to West Africa, and that finding is solid and well established. But in certain family lines, especially in the Southeast, a different lineage shows up at notable rates, one connected to North African and East African populations, including ancient Egyptian and Berber ancestry, and groups spread across the Maghreb and the Horn of Africa. Its presence in the Black American gene pool has usually been chalked up to North African ancestry that entered through one route or another, but exactly which route and exactly when still doesn't have a clean answer. There's also a lineage typically labeled as coming from European ancestry through slavery, but researchers studying Central and West African populations in the early 2000s found this same lineage showing up at rates in certain Cameroonian communities that matched or even exceeded the rates found in parts of Western Europe. That discovery forced scientists to rethink some basic assumptions about where this lineage actually originated and how it spread across the world in the first place. That rethinking is still happening today. When people take a consumer DNA test and get results that don't match the family story they grew up hearing, the reaction is rarely just simple surprise. It's a specific, disorienting feeling, like being handed a piece of yourself in a shape you didn't expect. Some people discover more European ancestry than they were prepared for, and have to sit with what that means about the history behind it. Some discover indigenous ancestry that older relatives always insisted was real, but that no paperwork could ever confirm. Some find North African or Middle Eastern markers that don't fit any family story they've ever been told. And some people find genetic signals the testing company simply cannot explain, signals that get quietly filed under an unassigned category that companies describe using vague language about statistical confidence, but which really just represents the edge of what current reference databases can actually detect. That unassigned percentage in a lot of Black American ancestry results is not meaningless static. It's information. It's the genetic record quietly pointing toward populations and migrations that current scientific models simply haven't been built to fully capture yet. Every single percentage point sitting in that unassigned category is an unanswered question that the mainstream ancestry industry hasn't seriously tried to answer. There's a specific ongoing research effort worth paying more attention to. A long-running project focused specifically on African American DNA has spent years collecting and analyzing Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA samples from Black Americans, trying to connect specific family lines to individual African ethnic groups, not just broad continental categories, the way most consumer tests do. That project has made real solid progress connecting specific Black American family lines to groups from Sierra Leone, Senegal, Nigeria, Cameroon, Congo, and Angola. But researchers connected to this kind of work have also, in conference talks and informal conversations with genealogists, described finding signal patterns in Black American samples that point toward populations that weren't part of the documented Atlantic slave trade at all. Populations from further east, populations connected to North Africa, populations that, according to the standard historical model, simply shouldn't be showing up in these results. The data exists. It's sitting in databases right now. The real question is what framework scientists eventually build to make sense of it, and whether they'll be willing to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads, even when that means complicating almost every official story about who Black Americans are and where their ancestors came from. Because the official story was always incomplete. Slavery functioned, among many other things, as a machine built to erase identity. It erased names, languages, religious traditions, family structures, and origin stories on a massive, systematic scale. The fact that African ancestry can still be traced in Black American DNA at all is proof of how much biology resists that kind of deliberate erasure. The genetic patterns that don't fit the simple version of the story aren't a flaw in the DNA. They're a flaw in the model built to interpret it. Family oral history deserves to be treated as real evidence too, even though it usually isn't. Across black communities throughout the Deep South, there are stories passed down for generations about ancestors who weren't brought over on slave ships at all, ancestors who were already here, who were indigenous, who were mixed, who came from somewhere the family could never quite name, but somewhere that wasn't the west coast of Africa. A lot of these stories got quietly pushed aside during periods when black Americans were building legal and political arguments around their identity as descendants of enslaved people, because claiming indigenous or pre-colonial ancestry sometimes complicated legal categories tied to civil rights arguments, land claims, and political alliances. The suppression wasn't always forced from the outside either. Sometimes communities chose to simplify their own family histories because complexity felt unsafe, or because certain doors, church communities, historically black institutions, fraternal organizations, only fully opened for families who accepted the standard version of the story. But those oral traditions survived underneath the surface, and now they're resurfacing in the form of genetic results that back up exactly what grandmothers were saying all along, even when official records never could. None of this is about replacing one identity with another. It's not about claiming black Americans are secretly something else entirely. It's about depth. It's about a population whose history is layered, violently disrupted, and deliberately obscured to the point that the full picture is still being pieced back together from scattered fragments, genetic fragments, oral fragments, archaeological fragments, and whatever bureaucratic paperwork managed to survive fires, floods, and record purges, some accidental, some not. The technology behind this research is improving faster than the frameworks used to interpret it. Full genome sequencing is now affordable enough that independent researchers and small genealogy projects can run it on entire population samples without needing a massive institutional budget. Scientists are extracting usable genetic material from ancient remains that used to be considered too damaged to test, and the software used to compare modern samples against ancient ones gets more precise every single year. What that means is simple. The gaps in these reference databases are closing, slowly, unevenly, with a lot of regional differences, but they are closing. Within the next decade or so, those vague, unassigned percentages in Black American ancestry results are likely going to start resolving into something far more specific. And when they do, the fuller picture that emerges is almost certainly going to be more complex, more global, and more ancient than the story most of us were ever told. Some of that complexity is going to be uncomfortable. It could complicate legal arguments, challenge long-standing community narratives, and unfortunately, give bad faith actors new ways to twist nuance to serve old, harmful agendas. Those risks are real, and they deserve serious attention. But the alternative, holding onto an overly simple story just because complexity is inconvenient, comes with its own cost. It means leaving millions of people holding ancestry reports that don't actually tell them the full truth about who they are. It means treating Black American history like a single, clean page, when the real record looks more like an old manuscript, written over again and again, layers of history stacked on top of each other, some partly erased, some hidden, but all of it still there, waiting for the right tools to bring it back into the light. DNA doesn't take sides. It doesn't care what a textbook says or what a marketing team at a genetics company decided was easier to sell. It simply carries the record of every population, every migration, every union that led to a person existing at all. In the most literal sense possible, it is the most honest document any of us will ever have about where we truly come from. And what it's showing us about Black America is this: the real story was always bigger than the one we were handed. Not a different story that erases the transatlantic slave trade or downplays the West African heritage that sits at the center of Black American identity. A bigger story. Older. More globally connected. Layered with indigenous presence, pre-colonial contact, and free Black history that plantation records, census forms, and Jim Crow-era paperwork were never designed to capture in the first place. Black Americans were never only what history books said they were. They were always this, too. If this brought up questions you haven't found answers to anywhere else, drop them in the comments below. We read everyone, and we come back to the ones that deserve their own deep dive. Subscribe if you want to be here when we do. There's a lot more buried history left to dig up, and we're just getting started.